The Greeks had filled their ships with gold and captive women, thinking they were rich. But as they pushed their oars into the water, the wind felt like a trap. They had won the war, but in the blood of that night, they had made themselves into something the world would no longer tolerate. The wreckage followed them into the deep. But for the High King of the Greeks, the sea allowed a safe crossing. The waves were calm, the wind was steady. The gods let Agamemnon sail all the way back to the rocky shores of Mycenae. They let him live, because they knew something worse was waiting for him at home. For 10 years, the city of Mycenae had sat in a heavy, suffocating silence. It was a fortress built of stones so massive that men believed giants had stacked them. It was designed to keep out armies, but walls of stone cannot keep out a curse. Inside the high palace, Queen Clytemnestra had waited a decade. She did not weep for her absent husband. She held the throne, watched the gates, and let her grief harden into stone. 10 years earlier, before the ships could even leave for Troy, the wind had died. To buy the breeze, Agamemnon had taken their eldest daughter, Iphigenia. He gagged her so she could not curse him, placed her on an altar and cut her throat. He traded his child's blood for a favorable wind. Agamemnon viewed the sacrifice as the hard price of war. Clytemnestra knew it was a murder. In the ancient world, blood spilled within the family does not wash away. It sinks into the floorboards. It demands repayment. Then, on a dark night, the watchman on the roof of Mycenae saw a spark on the horizon. A beacon fire. Then another, leaping from mountain to mountain across the sea. Troy had fallen. The king was coming home. When Agamemnon's chariot rolled through the lion gate of Mycenae, his armor caught the fierce light of the sun. Behind him rolled wagons heavy with Trojan gold. Bound to his chariot was the ultimate prize, the prophetess Cassandra, daughter of the Trojan king, dragged across the sea as a slave. The citizens of Mycenae gathered in the dust, silent. They looked at their king, and they looked at the heavy timber doors. The doors swung open. Clytemnestra walked out into the sunlight. She praised the gods for her husband's return, speaking loudly so the city could hear her loyalty. Her voice was smooth, hiding the blade she had sharpened for 10 years. Then, she ordered the servants to unroll a path from the chariot to the palace doors. It was a tapestry of deep, bruised crimson. Woven with the crushed shells of sea snails, the dye was impossibly rare, meant only for the statues of the gods. It looked like a river of fresh blood spilling from the dark throat of the house, pooling at the wheels of the chariot. "Step down, my lord," she commanded gently. "Let not your foot, which has trampled Troy, touch the common dirt." Agamemnon hesitated. To walk upon the sacred crimson was an act of supreme hubris. It was a claim to divinity, the exact pride that made the heavens reach down and break a man's spine. He refused. He feared the jealousy of the gods. But Clytemnestra knew how to break him. She asked if Priam, the dead king of Troy, would have feared the silk. Agamemnon looked at the dirt. He looked at the blood-red path. He took off his heavy leather boots. Barefoot, the conqueror of Troy stepped onto the crimson silk. The fabric swallowed the sound of his feet. He did not look back. He walked straight into the shadow of the house, leaving the sunlight behind forever. Outside, the chariot remained. Cassandra, the captive prophetess, sat shivering in the heat. Apollo had cursed her to see the future, but to never be believed. Now, staring at the palace, the vision broke her. She did not see stone walls. She smelled old, rotting meat. She began to scream. She wailed that the house breathed murder. She saw a net. She saw an axe. She saw her own blood mixing with the king's. The citizens standing around the chariot tried to calm her, thinking she was simply a broken girl mourning her lost city. They did not understand that she was narrating an execution happening on the other side of the wall. Cassandra stopped screaming. The trap was already closed. She stepped down from the chariot, walked across the crushed red silk, and passed through the doors to join the dead. Deep inside the palace, Agamemnon had stripped off the bronze armor that had protected him for a decade. The house was quiet. The servants had prepared a warm, deep bath of beaten silver. He stepped into the water. For the first time in 10 years, he let his guard down. He closed his eyes. He never saw Clytemnestra enter the room. She carried a heavy woven net, a hunting tool meant to trap beasts. Before the king could open his eyes, she threw the heavy mesh over his head. Agamemnon thrashed in the water, but the net caught his arms, binding him tight against his own body. The man who had commanded 1,000 ships, who had burned a civilization to ash, was reduced to a tangled, helpless animal slipping on wet silver. Clytemnestra raised a heavy, double-bladed axe. She struck him once. The king groaned, a terrible, muffled sound from beneath the wet cloth. She struck him a second time. His legs gave out and he collapsed into the bloody water. She struck him a third time, offering the final blow as a dark prayer to the gods of the underworld. Blood sprayed across her face, hot and dark. She did not wash it off. She stood over the corpse, breathing the heavy air. This was not a murder. It was justice. When the palace doors opened again, the red carpet was gone. There was only the queen, flanked by her lover, Odysseus. She stood before the horrified elders of the city and pointed to the bodies of Agamemnon and Cassandra, wrapped in the bloody net. She dared anyone to challenge her. No one moved. Clytemnestra believed she had carved the sickness out of the house. She had secured the throne and seized control of her fate. But blood in the ancient world does not wash clean. It only drips down to the next generation. Somewhere in the hills, far from Mycenae, her young son Orestes was growing up. The gods were already writing his terrifying inheritance. The axe had fallen, but the curse was only taking a breath. The debt of Troy was paid, but the blood debt of Mycenae had just begun. If you want to see exactly how this bloodline curse rips the next generation apart, hit subscribe and ring the bell. The story of Orestes and the Furies is next. We dive deep into the darkest corners of myth every single week. Don't miss it. The floor of the house of Atreus was never dry. It did not matter how many slaves scrubbed the stones or how much thick incense was burned to choke out the metallic tang of the air. The blood of King Agamemnon remained, not as a simple stain, but as a living weight that sat on the chests of everyone who walked those halls. For 7 years, the palace had been a tomb where the living merely played at being royalty. In those 7 years, the city of Argos learned a new kind of silence. Clytemnestra, the queen with the heart of a man, sat on the throne with her eyes always fixed on the door. Beside her sat Odysseus, a man who had stepped into a dead king's sandals and found that power was the only thing that could keep his own ghosts from screaming. They reigned by a simple, brutal law. They had spilled blood to take the throne, and they would spill more to keep it. But blood has a long memory and a cold, patient hunger. Far to the north, in the iron hills of Phocis, that memory was waking up. Orestes was no longer the child smuggled out in the night while his father's life drained into a guest bath. He was a man built of shadows and sharpening bronze. Yet he was not moved by simple grief. He was moved by a command that felt like a rot in his bones. He had stood in the white, blinding heat of Delphi, where the sun strikes the marble like a hammer. There, the god Apollo spoke. The command was not an invitation, it was a threat. The god did not speak of justice. He spoke of the balance of the earth. Your father was a king, the voice had echoed, cold as a mountain spring. He was slaughtered like an ox at the trough by those who shared his bed. If you do not hunt the hunters, the earth itself will turn its face from you. Your skin will scale with leprosy. You will be driven from every hearth, every altar, every city. You will be a ghost before you are a corpse. Orestes understood. There was no healing for a house like his. There was only the price. To the gods, a murdered king is a hole in the fabric of the world that can only be filled by the bodies of the killers. He turned toward Argos. Beside him walked Pylades, a man of such deep silence he seemed to be made of the mountain itself. They did not come with an army. They came with a lock of hair and a lie that tasted like ash. They came to see if the blood on the floor finally wanted to be fed. Argos appeared on the horizon like a bleached skull. Orestes did not go to the palace gates to demand his crown. He went to the dirt. Agamemnon's tomb was a neglected mound on the edge of the city, a place where no birds sang, and even the wind seemed afraid to stir the dust. Orestes knelt. He cut a lock of his hair and laid it on the parched earth. "Father," he whispered, and the word felt heavy, like a stone dropped into a void. "I am the hand you sent into the future. I am the shadow of your death. Watch me." He was not alone. From the trees came a procession of women draped in black, their faces scratched in mourning. These were the libation bearers, sent by a queen who had begun to wake up screaming. Clytemnestra had dreamt of giving birth to a snake, and the snake had bared its fangs at her breast, drawing blood with its milk. She hoped a few jars of wine poured for the dead king would buy her a night without dreams. Among the women stood one whose face was a mirror of Orestes' own, though hers was a mirror clouded by years of breathing the dust of a dead house. Electra. She did not recognize her brother at first. She saw only a stranger standing at her father's shame. But then, she saw the lock of hair. She saw the footprints in the dust that matched the measure of her own feet. In a world of shifting lies, the scent of the common blood does not deceive. The reunion was not a moment of warmth. It was the striking of flint against steel. Electra did not ask her brother if he was happy. She asked if he was ready. "The net is already spread," she told him, her voice a low, jagged rasp. "Our mother sleeps in the bed she stole, dreaming of the blade. For 8 years, I have lived as a slave in my own home, sharpening my hatred like a knife. Do not tell me of mercy, Orestes. Mercy is for those who still have a home. We only have a grave." The plan was a dark reflection of the original crime. Years ago, Clytemnestra had used a guest bath to trap a king. Orestes would use a guest right to trap a queen. He would walk through the front doors not as a messenger, but as a ghost, returning to the scene of his own disappearance. He would tell the queen that her son was dead. He would bring her the one thing she wanted most, the silence of a grave she no longer had to fear. The gates of the palace groaned as they swung open. To Clytemnestra, the news of Orestes' death was an end. It was as if the past had finally bled itself white. If the son was dead, the debt was gone. There was no one left to collect. She welcomed the messengers with the cold hospitality of a spider. She played the part of the grieving mother for the public, but her eyes were bright with a terrible predatory relief. She sent for Aegisthus. She wanted them to celebrate their safety in the dark. Aegisthus walked into the palace unarmed. He was smiling. He was a man who believed the long, hard winter of his paranoia was finally over. He walked past Orestes without a second glance, seeing only a dusty traveler from a far-off land. He entered the inner chamber. The heavy oak door thudded shut. There was a single, sharp sound. It was not a scream, but a sudden, violent gasp. The sound of a man trying to breathe through a throat that was no longer whole. Aegisthus fell. He died on the same floor where Agamemnon had bled, wearing the rings of a man he had butchered. Then came the silence. The servants fled into the shadows. The torches flickered in the sudden draft. Orestes stood over the body, his chest heaving, his sword dripping red onto the stone. But the weight was not yet lifted. Aegisthus was the lover. He was the accessory. He was the easy part of the debt. A door at the end of the long hall opened. Clytemnestra walked in, alerted by the silence. She saw the body of her lover. She saw the blood. She looked at the young man with the shaking hands and the blood-spattered face, and she did not need to ask his name. A mother knows the shape of the ghost she created. She did not reach for a dagger. She did not call for the guard. She did something far more devastating. She reached for her robes and pulled them back. She bared her breast, the very flesh that had warmed him. the source of the milk that had kept him alive when he was a helpless thing. "Son," she said, her voice dropping the mask of the queen and becoming the voice of the womb. "Have you no awe for this? I am the source of your life. If you spill my blood, you are merely cutting your own throat." Orestes froze. The sword, which had felt light as a feather when it struck Aegisthus, now felt as heavy as the palace itself. This was the wall that no revenge could climb. To kill a murderer was law. To kill a mother was a crime against the very sun and moon. He turned to Pylades, his eyes wide and frantic, pleading for a way out of the trap. "What do I do?" he whispered. "Can I strike the woman who gave me breath?" Pylades, who had been a shadow for the entire journey, spoke for the first and only time. His voice was not the voice of a friend, but the cold, echoing iron of the god at Delphi. "What then becomes of the words of Apollo? What of the sworn oaths you made at the grave? Count all the world your enemy Orestes, rather than the gods. Strike." The choice was severed. The god had spoken, and the human heart was forced to go quiet. Orestes grabbed his mother by the hair and dragged her toward the cooling body of her lover. "You loved him more than the man who wore the crown." Orestes spat, though his voice was thick with a horror he could not name. "So go, sleep with him in the house of the dead." The struggle was not clean. It was a messy, frantic business of meat and bone. Clytemnestra fought with the strength of a cornered beast, her nails tearing at his arms, her blood slicking the floor until they both slid in the red mire. When the blade finally found its mark, the queen slumped into a heap of purple silk and cooling skin. Orestes stepped back, his breath coming in ragged, shallow sobs. He waited for the feeling of triumph. He waited for the light of Apollo to fill the hall and wash away the stench of the room. He had followed the command to the letter. He had balanced the scale. He took the ancient, blood-crusted robe, the net his mother had used to trap his father, and spread it out over the two bodies. He wanted to justify the horror. He wanted the world to see the evidence of why this had to happen. "Look," he cried to the empty pillars. "Look at the web that caught a king. Look at the shroud she wove for his death. I have paid the house in red. The dead is gone." But the floor was not clean. The blood of a mother does not soak into the stone like the blood of a stranger. It remains on the surface. It begins to move. In the flickering shadows behind the statues, something shifted. Orestes blinked, wiping the sweat and gore from his eyes. He saw them first as curls of black smoke, then as shapes. They were women, but their skin was the color of a bruised lung. They had snakes for hair that hissed with 1,000 tiny tongues, and their eyes wept a black, corrosive slime. They did not speak. They made the sound of 100 starving dogs barking at the bottom of a well. The smell reached him then, the stench of old copper and sour milk. The Furies. "Do you see them?" Orestes shrieked, backing away from the bodies. "The women in black. The snakes." Pylades looked at the empty shadows, his face pale but calm. "There is nothing there, Orestes. It is the blood on your hands. It is the heat of the deed. You need to rest." "No!" Orestes screamed, clawing at his own face as if to tear the vision away. "They are not shadows. They are the hounds of my mother. They have found the scent. They are coming to drink." This was the final cruelty of the law. Orestes believed that by killing the murderer, he was stilling the blood. He did not realize that the law of the mother is older and darker than the law of the father. The Furies do not care about justice. They do not care about Apollo's commands or Agamemnon's ghost. They only care about the blood bond. To them, Orestes was not a hero. He was a traitor to his own flesh, a thing that had turned its own blood into a weapon against the source of its life. He began to run. He fled from the palace of Argos, leaving behind the crown he had traveled so far to claim. He ran from the sister who had watched the slaughter with a cold, terrifying satisfaction. He ran until his sandals tore and his lungs burned with the heat of the chase, but the sound of the barking stayed exactly 3 paces behind his heels. The light of Delphi was gone. There was only the pursuit. The house of Atreus was finally just. The usurpers were dead. The true heir had returned. But the heir was a madman screaming at the wind, and the throne was merely a chair in a house of ghosts. The burden of blood is a circle. It never ends in peace. It only ends when the last person who remembers the grudge is driven into the earth. Orestes fled toward the horizon, a king of nothing, hunted by the very justice he thought would set him free. The debt was not paid. It had simply changed hands. If you want to see the final judgment of Orestes, where the gods themselves must go to trial to stop the killing, subscribe and wait for the next chapter. The Furies are not finished. The debt was not paid. It had only changed hands. Orestes ran until the leather of his sandals tore and the stones of the road cut deep into his bare heels. He ran until his lungs burned with the metallic taste of his own exhaustion, coughing up dust and bile. But no matter how fast he moved, the sound stayed exactly 3 paces behind him. It was a wet, heavy sound. The sound of hounds tracking a fresh kill through the brush, mixed with a low, wordless singing that made the hair on his arms stand up. The Furies did not sprint. They did not need to. They walked, dragging their shadow over the earth, because the doom they carried was an absolute law. Orestes, the rightful king of Mycenae, had killed his mother. To him, it was a necessary execution to avenge his murdered father. To the Olympian gods, it was the restoration of a stolen throne. But the Furies were older than the Olympians. They were born from the drops of blood that fell when the sky itself was castrated in the beginning of time. They did not care about thrones or the commands of a newer generation of gods. To the Furies, a child who spills maternal blood is an abomination. It is a thing that has turned its own blood into a weapon against the source of its life. That thing must be hunted until its mind splinters and its flesh is pulled down into the dark. Orestes fled toward the blinding white sanctuary of Delphi. He dragged his bleeding legs across the marble steps and collapsed at the central altar of Apollo. He clung to the sacred stone, his hands still crusted with his mother's dried blood. He had followed Apollo's direct command to the letter. He expected a shield of divine fire. He expected the god of light to burn the monsters away and declare him clean. Apollo did appear, but what happened next broke the foundation of the ancient world. The god of prophecy stood in his own temple, radiating heat. With a sharp, sudden gesture, Apollo cast a heavy, unnatural sleep over the monstrous women crawling toward the altar. The hounds collapsed against the marble. The singing stopped. Orestes gasped for air, looking up at the god, waiting for the purification, waiting for the blood to flake off his hands. But Apollo did not raise his hands to bless him. The god looked down at the mortal and told him to run to Athens. In that terrible, quiet moment, Orestes realized the truth. Apollo could drug the monsters, but he could not banish them. He could not undo the sin. The god of light, a supreme Olympian, lacked the power to overrule the ancient enforcers of the earth. He had obeyed a god, and the god could not save him. The sleep would not hold for long. Orestes fled Delphi, leaving the safety of the temple behind. For a year, he existed as a ghost. His mind began to splinter under the weight of the invisible pursuit. He chewed on bitter bark, sleeping in ditches, his royal cloak stiff with mud and his own filth. He dared not close his eyes for long, because the moment the world went quiet, he could hear the singing again. The Furies were tracking the rotting smell of his soul. He was no longer a king. He was a weapon that the gods had used to settle a score, and now he was being slowly discarded to the beasts. Finally, starving and hollow, he dragged himself into the city of Athens. He crawled up the steep, rocky hill of the Acropolis and threw his arms around the ancient olive wood statue of Athena. He pressed his face against the carved wood and screamed for judgment. He was not asking for a pardon. He was asking for an end to the chase. The goddess of wisdom descended. Athena stood before the ruined prince and the snarling horrors that had tracked him to her steps. The white stone of Athens was suddenly fouled by the smell of stagnant water and decaying meat. She saw the trap immediately. If she allowed the Furies to tear Orestes apart on her altar, she would prove that obeying the Olympian gods was a death sentence. No mortal would ever trust heaven again. But if she used her spear to drive the Furies away by force, she would break the oldest law of the universe. The Furies would curse her city. They would turn the soil to ash, rot the wombs of the women, and plunge Athens into endless famine. The goddess of war realized this was a battle she could not win by force. So she did something entirely unprecedented. She surrendered her absolute authority. Athena declared that this matter was too heavy for one god to decide. She would not cast a lone judgment. Instead, she summoned 12 mortal men, the oldest, most respected elders of Athens. She ordered them to gather on the rocky outcrop known as the Areopagus, the Hill of Ares. She drew a line in the dust. She placed Orestes in the center. On one side stood Apollo, blazing with the arrogant light of Olympus, representing the necessity of the murder. On the other side stood the Furies, a chorus of nightmare clad in black, oozing venom from their eyes, representing the unbreakable law of the blood bond. The gods had drawn a circle in the dirt, forcing mortal men to break a deadlock that heaven itself was too terrified to touch. The trial began, and the air on the hill grew cold. The Furies did not use rhetoric. They spoke with the heavy, crushing weight of stone. They pointed at Orestes and demanded his life. A mother's blood is the root of the world. Break that bond, they argued, and no hearth will ever be safe from the knife. If a son can butcher the woman who bore him and walk away clean, then every house will drown in its own gore. Children will slaughter their elders for scraps of meat. Fear of the Furies, they hissed, is the only thing keeping men from tearing each other open in the dark. Apollo stepped forward. His defense was desperate and freezing. He did not ask for mercy. He did not claim Orestes was a good man. Instead, the god argued that a mother is not a true parent at all. She is merely a vessel, a temporary nurse for the seed planted by the father. To kill a mother is not a crime against one's own blood, because the only true blood comes from the sire. It was a cold, bloodless logic. Apollo denied the earth itself, reducing the ancient power of the mother to nothing. The 12 mortal elders stared at the dirt, refusing to meet the eyes of the shining god or the rotting monsters. They were trapped between the shrieking terror of the old world and the freezing cruelty of the new. Athena stepped forward and ordered the vote. There would be no more words. 2 clay urns were placed in the center of the rock, one for condemnation, one for acquittal. One by one, the 12 mortal elders stood. The silence over Athens was absolute. The wind died down. The Furies stopped their hissing. The only sound in the world was the slow dragging of mortal feet against the stone, followed by the sharp, hard clack of a pebble dropping into clay. 12 men. 12 stones. When the final elder sat down, trembling, the urns were emptied and the stones were counted. 6 pebbles for death, 6 pebbles for life. Mortal judgment had failed. The scales hung dead level. Orestes squeezed his eyes shut, bracing his neck for the tearing of claws. The Furies leaned forward, their jaws unhinging. But Athena had kept 1 pebble in her hand. As the patron of the city, she cast the deciding vote. She dropped her stone into the urn of acquittal, declaring that a tied vote would always fall to the accused. She chose the father. She chose the cold stone of the city over the wet, ancient soil of the earth. Orestes was clean. The chase was over. He collapsed in the dirt, weeping, swearing an eternal oath of alliance between Argos and Athens. He rose, a free man, and walked down the hill. But the myth does not follow him home. Orestes leaves the story hollowed out, an instrument used to break the old world, leaving nothing of the man behind. He had his life, but his soul had been burned away. The true crisis had just begun. The Furies erupted in a wail that shook the foundation of the Acropolis. They had been robbed by a trick of mortal stones. They turned their rotting eyes on Athens. They swore to bleed venom into the earth. They promised that no crop would ever grow, no child would be born whole, and every citizen would choke on the ash of their own city. They prepared to unleash the blight they had just been denied. Athena gripped her spear, but she did not raise it. She knew the monsters were right. A city cannot exist purely on cold logic. A city needs fear. Without the terror of consequence, laws are just words carved in dead stone. Justice required the monsters. So the goddess of wisdom offered a terrible bargain. She told the Furies not to leave. She offered them a permanent throne in the dark caverns deep beneath the courthouse of the Areopagus. If they agreed to stay, no citizen of Athens would ever marry, or build a house, or pass a judgment without first pouring honey and blood into the earth to honor them. They would no longer be hunted demons in the wilderness. They would be worshipped. They would be called the Eumenides, the kindly ones. It looked like peace, but it was the darkest compromise in human history. Athena did not defeat the horror of blood vengeance. She carved it into the bedrock of the city. The monsters did not die. They became the silent, crushing weight behind every judge's gavel. In Greece, the ancient cycle of blood had finally been bound by law. But across the sea, in the smoking ruins of Troy, one last survivor was still wandering, about to learn a much harder truth. Even the favor of heaven cannot save the dead. If you want to see the final survivor of Troy drag the ashes of his city across the ocean to build an empire of blood, subscribe and wait for the next chapter. In Greece, the ancient cycle of blood had finally been bound by law. But across the sea, in the smoking ruins of Troy, one last survivor was still wandering, about to learn a much harder truth. Even the favor of heaven cannot save the dead. When the walls of Troy finally cracked, the surviving kings scattered into the wind. Some dragged the ashes of their city across the ocean to build new empires. They chose the future. But for Odysseus of Ithaca, the sea became a trap. He had burned a city to the ground, but the gods of the ocean refused to let him wash the smoke from his hands. His ships were blown off the edge of the known map. His men were hollowed out by monsters, starvation, and salt. He was a king without a kingdom, navigating a world that had stopped making sense. To find his way home, the witch Circe gave him a command that chilled his blood. He had to seek directions from the blind prophet Tiresias. The only problem was that Tiresias was dead. Odysseus was instructed to sail his black ship beyond the borders of the sun. He had to cross the deep, freezing stream of the river Oceanus, where the water did not move like the sea, but dragged against the oars like wet, heavy earth. He sailed until he reached a shore where the light of day had never touched the ground. He did not find a kingdom of fire. He did not find a majestic throne room of solemn judgment. He found only a damp, endless void at the bottom of the world, a place of rot, cold mud, and absolute forgetting. To get an answer from the dark, Odysseus could not simply ask. The dead do not have voices. They do not have minds. To make them speak, he had to offer the one thing they no longer possessed. He had to pay in heat. He had to pay in blood. Odysseus stepped onto the ashen shore. The air was so heavy it tasted like iron. He drew his bronze sword and dropped to his knees, digging a trench nearly a meter deep into the dead earth with his bare hands and the flat of his blade. To open the gates of the dark, he poured the heavy libations required by the old gods. First sweet honey and milk, which curdled instantly in the freezing dirt. Then dark wine, then pure water, scattered with white barley. Finally, he dragged a black ram and a black ewe to the edge of the pit and drove his blade through their throats. The thick, steaming blood poured into the dirt. What happened next was not a quiet communion with the spirits. It was a siege. The moment the scent of hot blood hit the stagnant air, the earth began to boil with shadows. They came out of the fog in their thousands. Brides who had died before their wedding nights, old men broken by toil, young warriors still wearing armor crusted with the dried gore of ancient battles. They crawled and dragged themselves out of the dark, shrieking with a thin, high sound that made the living king's teeth vibrate in his skull. They were starving. The dead have no memory of who they were unless they drink from the warmth of the living. Odysseus stood over the pit, gripping his sword. The king who had broken the walls of Troy was reduced to swinging his bronze in the dirt, hacking at empty air to keep the screaming dead away from the blood. The first shade to reach the edge of the pit was not a mighty king. It was Elpenor, one of his own crewmen, who had died just days before, his neck broken in a drunken fall, his body left unburied in the rush to leave Circe's island. The ghost wept, begging Odysseus to return and burn his corpse. If a man was forgotten in the dirt above, his soul was condemned to drift in agony below. It was the first crack in the king's armor, a brutal reminder that a leader's negligence carried a price that lasted forever. Before the king could dwell on his failure, a second shadow pushed through the fog. Odysseus felt his breath stop. It was his own mother, Anticlea. When he had left for Troy 10 years ago, she had been standing in the sunlight of Ithaca, alive and whole. Now she was a hollow, shrieking husk, dragging herself toward the blood. Odysseus wept, but the iron law of the ritual held him. He had to hear the prophecy first. He raised his bronze sword, pointing the blade directly at the throat of his own dead mother, forcing her back into the cold dark so the prophet could drink. Finally, the blind seer Tiresias emerged from the mist. He knelt, drank the black blood, and the fog retreated from his mind. Tiresias delivered the crushing truth. The journey was not over. Even if Odysseus survived the wrath of the sea and reclaimed his home, he would not find peace on his throne. He would have to take a heavy ship's oar, walk inland until he found people who did not know what salt tasted like, and plant the wood in the dirt to appease the god of the ocean. The sea would always be waiting for him. As the prophet faded back into the dark, Odysseus lowered his sword. He allowed his mother to step forward and drink, only to learn that she had died of sheer, consuming grief, waiting by the shore for a son who never came. When he reached out, desperate to hold her, his arms passed through her shadow 3 times, grasping nothing but cold air. Then came the kings. Through the shrieking chaos, Odysseus saw Agamemnon, the high king of the Greek armies, the man who had commanded the greatest fleet in human history, the man who had sacrificed his own daughter to the gods just to get the wind to reach Troy. Agamemnon crept forward, drank from the dirt, and wept. His chest was a ruin of dark, gaping mouths where the axe had fallen. He told Odysseus that he had finally returned home a victor, stepped into a warm bath, and was butchered by his own wife like an ox at a trough. The victory at Troy had bought him nothing but a knife in the dark. The victor's prize was exactly the same as the loser's curse. Agamemnon's final advice to the man who won the war was bitter and paranoid. Trust no one, not even the woman in your own bed. The old laws of the earth were failing, but the dark was not finished with him. Out of the gloom strode the massive, brooding shadow of Ajax, the second greatest warrior of the Greeks. Ajax had killed himself in a fit of madness after Odysseus outsmarted him to claim the armor of Achilles. Odysseus called out to him, offering words of peace, begging the great warrior to let go of his anger and death. Ajax did not answer. He did not yell. He simply turned his massive back and walked away into the absolute dark. The silence of the betrayed hit harder than the shrieking of the swarm. The 10 years of war, the burned cities, the pursuit of immortal fame. It was all turning to ash in the cold mud. And then, the shrieking crowd of shades went entirely silent. The swarm parted. The greatest of them all approached the trench. Achilles. This was the man who had chosen a short, violent life in exchange for eternal glory. Achilles had been the greatest killer of the age, the untouchable terror of the plains. He had traded the chance of growing old for the iron promise that his name would outlive the stones of the earth. If anyone had won the old oath of the warrior, it was him. Achilles knelt by the trench. He drank the blood. He looked up at the king of Ithaca. Odysseus, desperate to find some meaning in the slaughter they had both survived, tried to comfort the fallen legend. He reminded Achilles of his unequaled status. He told him that he had been honored like a god in the sunlight, and that even here in the gloom, he must rule as a mighty lord among the dead. Achilles looked at Odysseus. A long, terrible silence hung in the dead air. When he spoke, he did not boast. His voice was hollow, stripped of all pride and fury. "Do not try to comfort me for my death, shining Odysseus," the ghost replied. "I would rather be a paid servant, bound to a poor man who has no land and little grain, than be the undisputed king of all the dead." The man who had defined glory rejected it entirely. The statues did not matter. The terror he had inflicted on the Trojan plains was nothing but dust in the dark. A starving, exhausted laborer breathing the cold morning air was infinitely richer than the most famous ghost in the underworld. Achilles asked only about his son, desperate to know if a piece of his blood still walked in the sun. Upon hearing that his son fought bravely, the ghost of the greatest warrior turned and walked back into the endless gray meadow of asphodel. He took no kingdom with him, only the fading memory of light. Odysseus stood alone by the blood trench. The old oath of the warrior was dead, but the quiet did not last. The swarm began to press in again, tens of thousands of faceless dead shrieking for a single drop of life. The sound became a crushing weight, pressing against his skull. A colder dread took hold of him, a sudden freezing certainty that Persephone was about to send the monstrous head of the Gorgon up from the depths to turn him to stone. He did not stay to fight them. He dropped his sword, turned his back on the darkness, and fled toward his ships. The gods who demanded blood in exchange for immortality were liars. There was no glory in dying for a song. There was only the brutal, absolute necessity of survival. He could not fight the sea with a sword. He could not conquer his way home. He had to become something else. Willing to sink into the dirt, willing to lie, willing to endure anything, just to keep breathing. The golden armor was heavy, but a single breath was worth more than all the songs in the world. Next time we watch a king learn how to become a beggar, and a hero learn how to lie. Subscribe, and wait for the reckoning. In the underworld, the ghosts of Troy warned Odysseus that the old laws of glory were dead. But before he learned that lesson in the dark, he had to learn it in the light. He had to learn that the trap that held him was built by his own mouth. Shortly after the walls of Troy burned, the sea was not yet a curse. The winds were favorable, the black ships were heavy with plunder, and the map home was clear. But survival was not enough for a king who had spent 10 years carving his name into the history of the world. The fleet dropped anchor off the coast of a wild, unnamed island. It was a land without ships, without laws, and without gods. It was the territory of the Cyclopes, massive, solitary monsters who answered to no king. Odysseus took 12 of his best men and walked inland. He expected the old rules of the world to hold true. He expected the safety of a guest. Instead, he found a cave that smelled of rotting whey and raw meat. When the owner returned, the shadow that fell over the mouth of the cave blocked out the sun. Polyphemus was a mountain of muscle and coarse hair. He drove his massive flocks of sheep inside, and then, with casual, terrifying ease, he lifted a slab of solid rock the weight of a mountainside and dropped it over the entrance. The doorway was sealed. No 50 men could have moved it. Odysseus stepped forward from the shadows. He spoke the language of the old world. He invoked the gods. He demanded guest gifts, reminding the giant that he was a warrior of Agamemnon, a conqueror of Troy. Polyphemus did not argue theology. He did not care about Troy. Without a word, the giant reached out, grabbed 2 of the hardened Greek veterans by their legs, and swung them like grain stalks against the stone floor. Their skulls shattered. The giant tore them limb from limb and ate them raw, crunching through bone, marrow, and bronze armor alike. Then he went to sleep. In the dark, Odysseus drew his sword. He crept toward the snoring mass of flesh. The killing stroke was clear. A single upward thrust beneath the ribs would end the threat. But as the bronze hovered over the skin, the cold logic of the trap froze the king's hand. If he killed the monster could not move the stone. They would slowly starve to death in a tomb of their own making. He was caught in a bitter knot. To survive, he had to let the butcher live. Over the next day, Polyphemus ate 4 more men. With every sunset, the king's crew grew smaller. To survive the cave, Odysseus had to abandon the instincts of a warrior and learn to scavenge in the dark. He found a massive piece of unseasoned olive wood, ordered his men to sharpen it to a brutal point, and hid it deep in the dirt. That evening, when the giant returned and ate 2 more men, Odysseus stepped forward not with a sword but with a bowl. He offered the giant dark, unwatered wine from his ship's stores. Polyphemus drank. He demanded another. The alcohol, foreign to the brute's blood, hit him like a heavy stone. As the giant swayed, he asked the Greek king for his name, promising him a final gift in return. This was the moment the scale tipped forever, the moment the king had to choose between his pride and his breath. "My name is Nobody," Odysseus said. The giant laughed, a wet, terrible sound. "Then my gift to you, Nobody, is that I will eat you last." The giant collapsed, vomiting into the dirt. Odysseus and 4 men dragged the sharpened olive stake from the shadows. They thrust it deep into the dying embers of the fire until the point glowed white-hot. They moved in silence. They hoisted the burning timber onto their shoulders, positioned it perfectly over the giant's single closed eyelid, and drove their entire combined weight downward. The giant screamed. The sound was so concussive it knocked the men backward. Blood and boiling fluid hissed around the burning wood. Polyphemus thrashed in agony, tearing the stake from his face, roaring for help. The other Cyclopes on the island heard the shrieks and gathered outside the sealed rock. "Who is killing you?" they shouted through the stone. "Is someone attacking you by force or by deceit?" Polyphemus howled back from the dark. "Nobody is killing me! Nobody is attacking me!" Outside, the giants muttered to themselves. If nobody was attacking him, it must be a sickness sent by heaven. They turned and walked away. The trick had worked. By shedding his name, Odysseus had severed the giant from his reinforcements. When dawn broke, the blind, bleeding monster rolled the boulder back to let his sheep out to graze. He sat in the doorway, sweeping his massive hands over the backs of the animals to ensure no men were slipping past him. But Odysseus had lashed his men beneath the bellies of the thick-fleeced rams. As the giant felt the wool on top, the men clung silently to the undersides. They passed right through the monster's hands, suspended inches from the dirt, breathing the stench of their dead friends on the giant's fingers. They reached the sunlight. They ran to the ship. They pushed off the sand. They took the oars and began to row. They had won. The escape was perfect. This is where the story should have ended. This is where the king should have sailed home in silence, accepting that survival was its own reward. But as the shoreline receded, a sickening tension began to build in Odysseus's chest. He looked back at the towering, blinded monster stumbling along the cliffs, hurling massive boulders into the sea at random. The rocks crashed into the water, churning the ocean into white foam, sending shockwaves into the wooden hull. Odysseus was safe, and he hated it. He could not bear the anonymity. He had spent 10 years bleeding on the plains of Troy just to ensure his name would outlive his flesh. The idea that this titan would sit in his cave, defeated, and never know who had broken him was an insult his blood could not swallow. Against the frantic begging of his crew, Odysseus stood up at the prow of the ship. He filled his lungs with the salt air. He shouted across the water, "Cyclops, if any mortal man asks you how you lost your eye, tell them it was Odysseus, the sacker of cities, the son of Laertes, the king of Ithaca." The silence that followed was absolute. On the cliff, the bleeding giant stopped thrashing. He lowered his massive hands. Polyphemus did not just throw another rock. He knelt on the cliff edge, raised his hands to the sky, and spoke directly to the god of the ocean. He took the name the king had just offered, and used it to draw a target on the ship. "Hear me, Poseidon, Lord of the dark sea," the monster prayed. "If I am truly your son, grant that Odysseus, king of Ithaca, never reaches his home." The sea beneath the black ship suddenly went cold. The wind died. The curse was locked in. He had not been cursed by a monster. He had forged the chains of his own exile, handed them to his enemy, and demanded that they be locked. The long ruin of the Odyssey did not begin with a storm. It began with a boast. Next time, we watch a king learn that the ocean does not forget a name. Subscribe and wait for the reckoning. The curse did not begin with a storm. It began with a dead calm. When Odysseus shouted his name across the water to the blinded Cyclops, he believed he was claiming his victory. He was wrong. He had marked his own ship for the deep. The giant had prayed to Poseidon, demanding that the king of Ithaca never reach his home. Now the sea was no longer just water. It was a waking wrath. It was a snare. The black ship sailed into a breathless expanse of ocean. The wind died. The men had to lower the sail and take to the heavy wooden oars. They were rowing into the territory of the sirens. Everyone knew the rumors. The sirens were monsters who lured sailors to their deaths upon jagged rocks. But the rumors misunderstood the weapon. The sirens did not sing of lust. They did not sing of physical pleasure. They were far more dangerous. They sang of the past. Odysseus ordered his men to soften beeswax in their hands and press it deep into their own ears. They were to hear nothing. But the king, a man who had spent 10 years carving his name into the history of the world, could not bear to be deaf to his own glory. He ordered his crew to bind him tightly to the wooden mast with heavy rope. He gave a strict command. No matter how he begged, they were not to untie him. As the ship slid into the rocky channel, the song began. It hit Odysseus like a physical blow. The voices were clear, pulling across the still water. They knew him. They called him by the name he had so proudly shouted. They sang of Troy. They sang of the blood in the dust, the bronze armor, the cunning traps he had laid. They promised him that if he stayed, he would never have to return to a complicated home. He could live forever in the memory of his greatest triumphs. The weapon was his own memory. The king thrashed against the ropes. The coarse hemp tore the skin from his wrists and chest. He screamed at his men, his face purple with rage, ordering them to untie him, to let him steer the ship into the rocks. He wanted to die inside his own legend. But the men were deaf. They saw their captain writhing like a madman, and following his earlier orders, they simply pulled the ropes tighter. They rowed in silence until the island fell behind them. Odysseus survived. But as the men removed the wax from their ears and unlashed him from the mast, a fracture had formed. The crew had seen their untouchable commander brought to his knees, begging to destroy them all for a song. The sea did not give them time to recover. Directly ahead lay a narrow strait flanked by towering cliffs. It was a throat of stone. On one side was Charybdis, a massive underwater vortex that swallowed the ocean itself 3 times a day, capable of pulling the entire ship down to the crushing dark. On the other side, high in a cave on the cliff face, lived Scylla. She was a horror of mutated flesh, possessing 6 long serpentine necks, each ending in a head armed with triple rows of jagged teeth. There was no middle path. To avoid the whirlpool meant sailing within reach of the cliff. Odysseus knew the brutal law of the strait. He had been warned by the sorceress Circe before they set out. If they sailed near Charybdis, everyone would die. The ship would be lost. If they sailed near Scylla, the monster would strike exactly once. She would take 1 man for each of her 6 heads. 6 men. It was a heavy, unavoidable toll. The king made the hardest choice of the war. He steered toward the cliff, and he committed the ultimate betrayal of command. He said nothing. He knew if he told his men the truth, terror would shatter them. They would drop the oars. They would drift into the whirlpool, and the entire crew would be annihilated. To save the ship, he had to march 6 of his loyal veterans to their execution, blind. He stood on the deck in his bronze armor, gripping his spears, pretending they could fight. The men rowed furiously, terrified of the roaring vortex of Charybdis on their left. They kept their eyes on the whirlpool. None of them looked up. Scylla struck without a sound. 6 long gray necks lashed down from the shadows of the cave. 6 sets of jaws clamped around the torsos of the strongest rowers. The men shrieked. They were pulled up into the air, their legs kicking wildly, their hands reaching down toward their captain. They screamed Odysseus's name, begging him to use his cunning to save them. Odysseus stood frozen on the deck. He did not throw his weapon. He could only watch as the men who had bled for him at Troy were dragged into the dark cave above, eaten alive. The screams echoed down the cliff face. The ship cleared the strait. They were alive, but the cost was ruinous. The crew looked at their king. He had armor on. He had weapons. But he had not fought. He was no longer a protector. He was a man who had bought his own breath with their blood. The final blow came on the island of Thrinacia. The men pulled the ship onto the sand with shaking hands and sunken eyes. They were on the beach of the sun god, Helios. The island was lush, populated by herds of magnificent golden-horned cattle. Odysseus gave them an absolute command. He told them the cattle were sacred. They belonged to the sun. If a single animal was touched, the ship would be destroyed. They had a small ration of grain left in the hold. They would eat that, rest for one night, and leave. But the ocean had other plans. Poseidon locked the wind. For a full month, a gale blew from the wrong direction. The ship could not be launched. The grain ran out. The men resorted to hunting scrawny birds and fishing in the shallows with bent wire. Hunger carved hollows into their faces. Every day, the fat, golden cattle grazed right in front of them, untouched. Odysseus, broken by the strain, walked inland to pray to the gods for salvation. Instead of answering him, the gods placed a heavy, unnatural sleep upon his eyes. He collapsed in the dirt. Back on the beach, the last thread of obedience snapped. A soldier named Eurylochus stood before the starving crew. He pointed to the cattle. "Every death is hateful to mortals," he said. "But to die of starvation is the most wretched death of all." He argued that it was better to risk a quick death by the wrath of the gods than to slowly rot away on a beach under a captain who had already traded their lives away. The men agreed. They did not just kill the cattle. They slaughtered them. They roasted the meat over fires, the fat hissing in the flames. Odysseus woke to the smell of burning meat. He ran back to the beach, screaming in horror. But it was done. The line had been crossed. For 6 days, the men feasted. On the 7th day, the wind suddenly changed. It blew fair for home. It looked like mercy. It was not. The men rushed to the ship, hauling up the sail, believing they had gotten away with the crime. They pushed off the sand and steered into the deep water. The island vanished behind them. Then the sky turned black. The gods had waited until they were far from shore, where there was no chance of survival. A sudden, violent squall slammed into the ship, snapping the forestays. The heavy wooden mast collapsed backward, crushing the skull of the helmsman. Before a single man could cry out, Zeus hurled a bolt of solid lightning directly into the center of the deck. The strike shattered the hull. The air filled with the smell of sulfur and burning pitch. The men were thrown into the freezing, churning ocean. They bobbed in the white foam for only a moment before the black waves pulled them under. Odysseus was thrown clear. He hit the water hard. When he surfaced, the screaming had stopped. There was only the roar of the wind. He swam through the wreckage, lashing the broken mast and the keel together with a leather strap. He pulled himself onto the crude raft. He looked around. There were no black ships. There was no crew. The men who had survived the 10-year war were all dead. The curse was complete. The sea did not want to kill Odysseus. The sea wanted to empty him. The blind giant's prayer was answered in full. The king of Ithaca would eventually reach his home. but he would arrive exactly as the curse demanded. Broken, stripped of all glory, and entirely alone. The crew is dead. The ships are gone. But the island of Ithaca still waits, and the throne is not empty. Next time, a beggar returns to his own house. Subscribe to Mythkipedia and wait for the reckoning. The sea did not kill Odysseus. The sea wanted to empty him. When the king of Ithaca finally washed onto the shores of his homeland, 20 years after he had first set sail, he arrived exactly as the curse had demanded, broken, stripped of all glory, and entirely alone. There were no black ships waiting in the harbor. There was no bronze armor, and there were no veteran spearmen standing beside him to announce his return. He woke in the sand, shivering under a thick, unnatural mist that clung to the rocks. For a terrifying moment, staring at the gray cliffs, he did not recognize the dirt of his own kingdom. He believed the gods had betrayed him one final time, tossing him onto yet another hostile shore. But the mist parted, and Athena stepped from the shadows. She did not come with a wreath of victory. She came with a warning. Ithaca was no longer his. His house had been invaded from within. 108 noblemen from the surrounding islands had occupied his great hall, believing Odysseus was dead at the bottom of the sea. They were demanding that his wife, Penelope, choose one of them to marry so they could claim the empty throne. They were not merely waiting. They were devouring his house piece by piece, slaughtering his cattle and terrorizing the servants who remained loyal. Worse, they had laid an ambush to murder his son Telemachus before the boy could come of age and challenge them. Odysseus gripped the cold sand. He wanted to march up the hill, kick open the oak doors, and shout his name, just as he had shouted it to the blinded Cyclops. Athena stopped him. She laid out the bloody truth of his return. If he walked into that hall as a king, he would die as a king. 108 swords against one meant he would be butchered on his own hearth, his bloodline extinguished forever. To survive the monsters of the sea, he had needed cunning. To survive his own house, he needed a weapon he had never possessed before: restraint. The man who had spent 10 years carving his name into the history of the world now had to erase it. Athena reached out and touched his shoulder, and the transformation was horrific. The thick, powerful muscles of his arms withered into stringy tendons. His smooth, sun-darkened skin wrinkled and paled, and his royal tunic dissolved into filthy, lice-ridden rags. He was no longer a warlord. He was a thing of dirt and hollow bones. He was a beggar. He walked inland to the smoke-filled hut of his loyal swineherd, Eumaeus, who offered the ragged stranger a scrap of meat, completely unaware he was feeding his own king. Odysseus listened to the man weep for his lost master, swallowing his pride and keeping his silence. When Telemachus finally arrived, narrowly evading the suitor's assassins, Athena briefly lifted the disguise. The young prince fell to his knees before the scarred, terrifying father he had never known. But Odysseus allowed him to weep for only a moment. The grief of the past was nothing compared to the danger of the morning. In the shadows of the hut, the father bound his son to a bitter oath. They would go down to the palace together, but they would go as strangers. Odysseus would wear the rags. He would be insulted, he would be struck, and he would be abused. Under penalty of a father's curse, Telemachus was ordered to hold his blade. No matter how the suitors tortured the beggar, the son was not to draw his sword. When Odysseus finally stepped over the threshold of his own great hall, the noise hit him like a physical blow. The smell of stale wine and roasted fat hung in the air, while men lounged on his chairs and spilled wine onto his stone floors. He moved through the crowded tables, holding out a dirty hand, begging for scraps of bread from the very men who were eating his inheritance. Then he came to Antinous. Antinous was the loudest of the lords, arrogant, cruel, and completely devoid of honor. When the beggar approached, Antinous sneered, refusing him food. Odysseus spoke quietly, pointing out the bitter irony that Antinous was refusing to share bread that did not even belong to him. The hall went dead silent. Antinous' face purpled with rage. He grabbed a solid wood footstool from the floor. let out a vicious grunt, and hurled it directly at the old man's back. The wood struck Odysseus exactly between the shoulder blades, a blow that should have shattered an old man's spine. Odysseus did not fall. He stood perfectly still, taking the full weight of the strike into his bones. For a fraction of a second, the disguise slipped. The king's eyes locked onto Antinous, and in that silent heartbeat, the warlord measured the exact distance to the man's throat. From the high table, Telemachus watched, white-knuckling his sword hilt as he shook with rage. Odysseus felt the violent urge to kill, the exact overwhelming pride that had doomed his crew at sea. But this time, the man held. He slowly lowered his head, relaxed his shoulders, and simply walked away to sit in the ashes by the doorway. The suitors laughed and returned to their wine, entirely unaware that the stool had not struck a beggar. It had struck a man who had already decided how they would bleed. By taking the blow without a sound, Odysseus had seen exactly what he needed to see. He knew who the leaders were. He knew which servants snickered and which ones looked away in shame. He marked the iron spears resting against the stone, memorizing the distance to each shaft. The suitors believed they were showing their dominance, not realizing they were simply showing him the order in which they would die. When night fell, Penelope came down to speak to the stranger. Sitting in the dark with his own wife, he listened as she confessed her spirit was broken. The suitors were demanding a decision by morning. He lied to her, offering false hope so her face would not betray the trap. But as they spoke, Penelope's old nurse washed the beggar's feet and felt a jagged, familiar scar above his knee. Euryclea gasped, her eyes going wide with terrifying recognition. Before she could cry out, Odysseus's hand shot forward and gripped the old woman's throat. In a cold, absolute whisper, he swore that if she made a sound, he would kill her alongside the suitors. To breathe a word was to slit her own king's throat. The terrified nurse nodded, and the secret held. The next morning, the sun rose over Ithaca for the feast of Apollo. The suitors gathered in the hall, louder and more arrogant than ever, demanding Penelope make her choice. She descended the stairs carrying something heavy, the massive recurved bow of King Odysseus, made of horn and wood. It was so stiff, so brutal in its draw weight, that no other man in the island's history had ever been able to string it. She stood before the 108 lords and announced the terms. Whoever could string the bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through 12 axe heads would win her hand and take the kingdom. The suitors cheered, pushing forward to prove their strength. From his place in the ashes by the door, the beggar watched them. He watched Telemachus quietly walk to the heavy oak doors of the great hall. He watched the loyal swineherd slip outside into the courtyard. The suitors thought they were competing for a wedding. They did not know that the iron bolts were sliding into place on the outside of the doors. They did not know that the beggar was patiently waiting for his turn. And they did not know that they were never leaving the room alive. The doors are locked. The bow is strung. Next time, the beggar sheds his rags, and the great hall runs red. Subscribe to Mythkipedia and witness the reckoning. The great bow of King Odysseus was not a ceremonial object. It was an instrument of war, crafted from thick animal horn and rigid wood, demanding brute, terrifying force to bend. One by one, the noblemen of Ithaca stepped forward to string it. One by one, the bow humiliated them. They greased the wood with hot tallow. They strained until the blood vessels in their necks swelled black. They tore the skin from their palms, but the wood would not yield. They had spent years eating the king's cattle, drinking his wine, and growing soft on his wealth. They had the arrogance of rulers, but the bodies of parasites. From his seat in the ashes by the heavy oak doors, the beggar watched them fail. When the last lord threw the bow to the stone floor in frustration, the beggar stood. He stepped forward and asked to test the wood. The great hall erupted in vicious laughter. Antinous, the cruelest of the suitors, threatened to have the old man's ears cut off for his insolence. But Telemachus, the young prince, coldly ordered the bow to be handed to the stranger. The lord sneered as the beggar took the weapon. He did not rush. He turned the bow in his dirty hands, inspecting it for rot or wormholes, moving with a calm, terrifying familiarity. Then, without straining, without a single wasted motion, he bent the great horn. He slipped the loop of the bowstring into its notch. He plucked the taut string, and it sang in the quiet hall with a sharp, lethal sound, like the cry of a swallow. The laughter died in the throats of the suitors. The color drained from their faces. The beggar picked up a bronze-tipped arrow, laid it across the grip, and drew the string back to his chest. He did not stand. Still seated, he released. The arrow hissed through the room, passing cleanly through the iron rings of 12 axe heads lined up in the center of the hall, burying itself in the solid oak door at the far end. Odysseus stood up. He stripped the filthy rags from his shoulders. "The test is over," he said. Before the men could fully understand the trap they were in, Odysseus drew a second arrow. He turned toward Antinous, who was raising a golden two-handled cup of wine to his lips. The bowstring cracked. The arrow drove straight through Antinous' neck. The bronze point tore through his throat. The warlord dropped the golden cup. Thick, dark blood jetted over the roasted meat and the bread on the table. He collapsed, kicking the table over, dying in the spilled wine and the ruins of the feast he had stolen. The lords did not reach for their swords. They scrambled backward like terrified cattle, overturning tables and slipping in the sudden pool of wine and blood. They looked desperately to the walls for their spears, but the stone was bare. Telemachus had removed the weapons the night before. They pushed against the heavy oak doors, but the iron bolts held. There was no way out. "You dogs!" Odysseus roared, his voice echoing off the stone like thunder. "You thought I would never come home. You consumed my house. You forced my women. You wooed my wife while I still drew breath. You feared no god and you expected no consequence. Now the snare has closed." Eurymachus, a desperate and wealthy lord, tried to bargain. He blamed the dead Antinous for everything. He offered to repay the cattle, the bronze, the gold, with heavy interest. He tried to buy his life with silver. Odysseus looked at the terrified man. "If you gave me your entire inheritance, all that you own and all that you could borrow, I would not stay my hands. You have only one choice now: fight or run." There was nowhere to run. Eurymachus drew a hidden bronze knife and charged. Odysseus shot him through the liver. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter in a sealed room. Odysseus stood on the raised threshold, raining arrows down into the panicked crowd. Men screamed, crawling under tables, using the bodies of their friends as shields. Telemachus fought beside his father, driving a spear through the back of a man who tried to rush the king. When the arrows ran out, they took up heavy spears and swords, hacking through the remaining lords in close quarters. The air grew thick with the smell of opened bodies, copper blood, and voided bowels. By the time the screaming stopped, the great hall was silent. 108 men lay dead, piled on top of each other in a grotesque, twitching heap. Odysseus stood in the center of the carnage, smeared in gore like a lion that had just fed on an ox. He ordered the unfaithful servants to be rounded up. There was no mercy. The treacherous goat-herd Melanthius was dragged into the courtyard, mutilated with bronze knives, and left to bleed to death in the dirt. The unfaithful maids were forced to drag the corpses of their dead lovers out of the hall and scrub the thick blood from the stone. When the hall was clean, Telemachus strung the women up by their necks, a dozen of them kicking in the air like trapped birds until they strangled to death. Odysseus burned sulfur to purify the air of his house. The usurpers were dead, yet the king felt only a deep, hollow exhaustion. He climbed the stairs to the royal chamber, where Penelope had slept through the slaughter. When she finally looked at him, testing him one last time with a secret about their marriage bed, the truth broke her. They wept in each other's arms, but the king's eyes remained guarded. The house was his, but the blood on his floors was permanent. To the king, it felt like justice. To the island, it was a declaration of war. By dawn, the silence of the palace was broken. Carts carrying the bodies of the 108 lords rumbled back to their estates. The wailing of mothers and the furious screams of fathers echoed across the island. Odysseus had acted as a righteous king, but in the brutal logic of the ancient world, He had just committed an unforgivable crime. He had wiped out an entire generation of Ithaca's nobility. Every dead man had a father, a brother, or an uncle bound by sacred oath to avenge their blood. The slaughter in the hall did not buy peace. It triggered a blood feud that would tear the island apart. In the center of the town, Eupeithes stared down at the corpse of his son, Antinous. He traced the ragged, gaping hole where the bronze arrow had torn through the young lord's throat. When he looked up, the weeping stopped. There was only the cold, absolute demand for blood. He stood before a furious mob, holding his son's blood on his hands. "If they let Odysseus live," he shouted, "they would be cowards forever." The mob seized their bronze spears, strapped on their shields, and began the march toward the king's country estate. Odysseus was sitting with his elderly father, Laertes, when the news arrived. The king looked at his scarred hands. He was exhausted. He had fought 10 years at Troy. He had fought 10 years against the sea. He had just fought a desperate battle in his own home. And now, he had to fight the fathers of the men he had killed. There was no end to it. The old law of blood demanded that every corpse be paid for with another corpse, an endless chain of murder that would not stop until the island was empty. Slowly, the old king Laertes, the war-weary Odysseus, and the young Telemachus put on their battered bronze armor. 3 generations of one cursed family, preparing to kill their own countrymen. They walked out to meet the mob in the dirt of the country estate. For a long, terrible moment, the two sides stood in silence, waiting for the first drop of blood to fall. Then the mob roared, rushing forward. Laertes cast a spear, driving it through the bronze helmet of Eupeithes, killing the father just as Odysseus had killed his son. Odysseus raised his sword, preparing to sink back into the endless, grinding cycle of vengeance. Then, the sky split open. A blinding flash of lightning struck the dirt between the two armies, throwing earth and smoke into the air. The crack of thunder deafened them. Athena dropped from the sky, her voice echoing with the terrifying absolute authority of the divine. "Hold your hands," she commanded the people of Ithaca. "Shed no more blood. End this war." The fathers dropped their weapons in terror, turning to flee. Odysseus, consumed by the battle rage he had carried since Troy, let out a terrifying war cry and prepared to hunt them down. But Athena stepped in his path. She ordered him to stop. She commanded him to put away the sword, warning him that if he struck one more blow, he would draw the personal wrath of Zeus. Odysseus froze. He looked at the fleeing men. He looked at the heavy bronze in his hand. And slowly, heavily, the great king lowered his weapon. There was no final, celebrated victory. There was only the cold, absolute command of a goddess, forcing the swords back into their scabbards. The gods had to step in because the men of the heroic age could no longer stop themselves. The age of heroes did not end in a blaze of glory. It ended with a command to lay down the iron, to bury the dead, and to finally, mercifully, sit in silence. Subscribe to Mythkipedia and witness the true cost of the myths.